The global order you rely on may already be collapsing. Here's the contradiction. What's being sold as chaos might actually be strategy, and what's marketed as stability may be the thing under attack. If that sounds abstract, it isn't, because the alliances, currencies, and security guarantees that shape your job, your savings, even your sense of safety, are built on an order now being described from inside Washington as obsolete. Behind the noise, a quiet shift is taking place. The familiar story says the world is split between democracies and autocracies, but the events unfolding don't line up with that script. Instead, they point to a deeper fracture inside the Western system itself, one where power structures created after World War II are no longer being defended by default. Here's why that matters to you. When the rules change, they don't announce it. They move first, explain later. Markets reprice, wars pause or escalate, allies are redefined, and by the time it's obvious, the leverage is gone. But here's the part nobody says out loud. If this dismantling is intentional, then the real target isn't who you've been told to watch. It's something much closer. The core event isn't a single speech, vote, or headline. It's a pattern that only becomes visible when you stop looking at moments and start looking at direction. Publicly, the message is confusion, mixed signals, abrupt decisions, but underneath the same pressure points keep getting hit again and again. Long-standing alliances are treated as negotiable. Institutions once described as untouchable are suddenly called outdated. Commitments that defined the last 80 years are reframed as burdens instead of foundations. And none of this is happening quietly. It's happening in full view, often dismissed as improvisation. Notice what's missing from the official explanations. There's no attempt to repair the system, no serious effort to modernize it. The language isn't reform, it's replacement. And that raises a question most coverage avoids. What if this isn't drift at all? What if it's a deliberate disengagement from a structure that no longer serves its original sponsor? If that's true, then every move that looks reckless starts to look consistent, and the story stops being about personalities and starts being about power. Now watch how fast this escalates. The claim sounds extreme, but the evidence follows a pattern. The post-war order isn't being neglected. It's being actively hollowed out. And the clearest signal isn't rhetoric. It's what's no longer treated as sacred. At the center of this shift is a blunt admission that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. The global framework built after World War II no longer fits reality. That statement alone reframes everything, because for 80 years, policy continuity was the rule. Presidents came and went, but the structure stayed intact. Now that structure is being openly questioned from the inside. Here's the detail that matters. When officials describe the world as multipolar, they're not just describing what exists. They're signaling acceptance. That's a break. It means power is no longer assumed to flow through one set of institutions, one alliance network, one enforcement mechanism. Notice what isn't being said. There's no declaration of a new system, no roadmap, no replacement architecture rolled out for reassurance. That silence is telling. It suggests the goal isn't to redesign the old order carefully, but to let it collapse under its own weight. Here's why that detail changes everything. Collapses don't require consensus. They only require withdrawal. And once withdrawal begins, the rest accelerates on its own. This is where the situation intensifies, because once withdrawal starts, others are forced to react. Systems built on assumption don't fail slowly. They fail when one participant stops playing their assigned role. There's a precedent for this, not in name but in behavior. Empires don't announce decline. They renegotiate commitments, delay guarantees, and redefine responsibilities. What looks like restraint on the surface functions as exposure underneath. When support becomes conditional, everyone downstream feels it. What's becoming normalized right now would have been treated as unthinkable before. Security assurances are no longer automatic. Collective obligations are spoken about as optional. Long-standing partners are told implicitly to carry risks they once outsourced. That's not a rhetorical shift, that's a structural one. But here's the flip. Once that line is crossed, you can't go back. Every actor begins planning for a world where backup might not arrive. Defense becomes local. Economics become regional. Coordination turns into competition. And notice what hasn't happened. There's been no emergency summit to lock everything back into place. No dramatic reaffirmation of the old guarantees. Just acceptance. Quiet recalculation. That's how normalization works. Not through collapse, but through adjustment. And adjustment is already spreading. The next layer is harder to ignore because it exposes a contradiction that keeps repeating. Public language still signals unity, private behavior signals distance, and the gap between those two keeps widening. Watch the actions instead of the statements. Engagements once treated as red lines are now managed conversations. Former adversaries are spoken to directly, while traditional partners are asked to wait. Pressure campaigns stall, escalations are delayed, and decisions that once required consensus are handled unilaterally. Here's the detail that reframes it. The most dangerous moves aren't the loud ones. They're the refusals, the guarantees not given, the automatic responses that never come. When an expected escalation doesn't happen, that's not hesitation, that's intent. Notice the contradiction. The system claims to be rules-based, but the enforcement mechanism is selectively disengaging. That means the rules still exist on paper, but the muscle behind them is being withdrawn, and a rule without enforcement is just a suggestion. This is the line that permanently changes how you see the issue. Power doesn't disappear when it steps back, it relocates. And when it does, everyone who relied on its presence has to improvise. That improvisation is already underway. Now the pressure starts stacking, and it happens fast. One development alone might look manageable. Two might look coincidental. Three, back to back, start to feel like loss of control. First, escalation points that once triggered immediate response are suddenly absorbed. Incidents happen, lines are crossed, and instead of retaliation, there's delay. Then parallel negotiations appear where confrontation was expected. Direct talks replace indirect pressure. And finally, responsibility is quietly pushed outward. Partners are told to manage their own risk, their own borders, their own fallout. This isn't stability, it's compression. When multiple tensions are held down at once, the system isn't calming. It's storing energy, and the pace matters. These shifts aren't spaced out over years. They're clustered, close enough that decision makers barely have time to adjust before the next one lands. Here's the attention reset. This isn't about one crisis. It's about how many can be managed simultaneously without something slipping. Because when systems rely on constant intervention to hold together, withdrawal doesn't create balance. It creates gaps. And gaps don't stay empty for long. This is where it stops being abstract, because the effects don't stay at the level of governments and summits. They move downstream into prices, into jobs, into the quiet assumptions you make about what will still work tomorrow. When security guarantees become conditional, markets notice first. Risk gets repriced. Insurance costs rise, supply chains shorten or break, and the shock doesn't announce itself as a crisis. It shows up as friction, delays, volatility, sudden reversals that feel personal, even when they're systemic. If you rely on stable currencies, predictable trade routes, or long-term planning, this shift hits you directly. Retirement timelines stretch, housing decisions pause, businesses hesitate, not because something has collapsed, but because no one is sure who steps in when something does. Remove ideology for a moment and look at the lived experience. Uncertainty taxes everyone. It forces defensive choices. People save instead of invest, hoard instead of expand, pull back instead of commit. And when enough individuals do that at once, the slowdown becomes self-reinforcing. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments, because recognition is usually the first signal that a pattern has already crossed into real life. And once it does, it rarely reverses quietly. To understand how this is even possible, you have to step back from personalities and look at mechanics. Systems don't persist because they're moral. They persist because they're incentivized. And when incentives shift, behavior follows, even if the language doesn't. The structure that's being strained here depends on leverage and expectation. Leverage comes from centralization, expectation comes from predictability. For decades, power flowed through a narrow set of institutions because everyone assumed they would always be backed, always be enforced, always be defended. That assumption did most of the work. Now watch what happens when that expectation weakens. Authority doesn't vanish overnight, it fragments. Decision-making slows, responsibility diffuses. Everyone waits for someone else to move first. And in that hesitation, influence migrates to whoever can act without consensus. Here's the unsettling insight. You don't need to overthrow a system to neutralize it. You only need to stop reinforcing it. Once reinforcement ends, the structure becomes performative. Meetings continue, statements are issued, but outcomes stop matching intentions. That's why this moment feels confusing instead of explosive. Power is shifting through absence, not force, and absence is harder to recognize until it's already reshaped the field. From here, the trajectory splits, and neither path is clean. One direction leads toward managed transition. Power continues to decentralize. Regional arrangements replace global ones. Negotiations multiply. Conflict doesn't disappear, but it becomes more contained, more transactional, less ideological. In that scenario, the old order fades without a single breaking point. It simply stops being the default. The other path is rougher. Withdrawal outpaces adaptation. Gaps open faster than new structures can fill them. Miscalculations stack. A localized crisis tests a guarantee that no longer functions, and the delay itself becomes the trigger. Not because anyone planned escalation, but because no one was sure who was responsible anymore. Here's the critical uncertainty. Both paths can look identical at first. Calm statements, controlled optics, reassurance layered over hesitation. Momentum builds quietly, not through declarations, but through habit. Each decision makes the next one easier to justify. And here's what makes this moment unstable. The next move doesn't have to be dramatic. It just has to confirm which direction is now assumed. That signal hasn't landed yet, but it's forming. Here's the insight that ties it together. What looks like disorder isn't necessarily failure. It's transition without consensus. And transitions like that don't feel historic while you're inside them. They feel confusing, uneven, hard to name. The story isn't about one country losing control or another gaining it. It's about a system built on automatic reinforcement discovering what happens when that reinforcement slows. Power doesn't collapse in those moments. It reappears elsewhere, shaped by whoever is willing to act without waiting. That's why the noise matters less than the direction. The headlines will keep changing, the arguments will keep cycling, but underneath, the same quiet shift continues. Away from permanence, away from assumption, toward a world where guarantees have to be earned instead of inherited. This isn't the end of the story. It's the setup for what comes next. Because once people realize the rules are moving, they start looking for where the leverage went. If you want to understand that next layer as it forms, follow and subscribe. We'll stay focused on the signals that actually move outcomes, not the ones designed to distract.